How do I sift through advertising gimmicks and make sure that I buy the right product? When I'm talking with my friends or family about big issues such as politics or religion, how do we have fruitful conversation? How do we come to agree? Or how do we know who's right? When I'm listening to a political debate, how do I know who is more rational? Let's talk about it. How do we engage in critical thinking? This is part 2 of a 2-part series on critical thinking. Let's look at some tools. So contained in this lecture, we're going to talk about intellectual moral virtues, worldview, the love of truth wherever it's found, what is an argument, ethos, pathos, logos, what is logic, and basic principles of logic, as well as logical fallacies. Plato says, all knowledge, when separated from justice and virtue, is seen to be cunning and not wisdom. Wherefore make this your first and last and constant and all-absorbing aim, to exceed, if possible, not only us, but all your ancestors in virtue. What does that mean? That means just knowing is not enough. Just thinking well is not enough. But can we think with virtue? Can we do it with good character? Also, Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. We want to examine our own life. Exert critical thinking skills not just on the culture around us and people we encounter, but on ourselves. Examine our own beliefs and see if there are good reasons that we have them. If you can't examine yourself, then you can't grow, you can't improve. You can't see where your errors are that need to be filled in and improved upon. What are intellectual moral virtues? Well, an intellectual virtue is a reasoning skill, according to Aristotle and Aquinas. So you can be smart, you can be observant, you can be very good at math, for example. But moral virtues are morally good character traits. This is the most common use of virtue. And so combining these two concepts, we have intellectual moral virtues. That's a good character trait applied to reasoning. So just because you're smart doesn't mean that you're good. But just because you're good does not mean that you're smart. When we talk about intellectual moral virtues, we're talking about learning to think well, but not just as a skill, but also as a moral endeavor. How can we think well morally? Let's look at some examples. Over on the right, we have our fallacy detector. As we look at some examples, we'll see some fallacies, some descriptions of some fallacies pop up. And later on in this video, we'll mention these again. So, think about the evil scientist. The scientist is a genius. He knows all about math and he can invent things, but he's evil. He has, in a limited sense, in an important sense, he has intellectual virtue, but not moral virtue. So although he is smart, he does not use his science for good causes, for good reasons. He has no intellectual moral virtue, so to speak. When we argue without respecting each other, we may have intellectual virtue, but we're not being moral towards each other. We're not being good. We're not expressing good character traits. Let's have respect. Respect is an intellectual moral virtue. That's an ad hominem fallacy. When we argue without respecting somebody, that means that we are attacking them and their person and their character instead of the argument itself and their ideas and the reasons for those ideas. When we have an argument and we express pride instead of humility, that is not intellectual virtue or intellectual moral virtue. So when we get in a fight, we should have the humility to admit when we're wrong. If we truly love wisdom, if we are lovers of wisdom, which Is. When when we make passive-aggressive comments on social media or fail to respond to someone, neglect them in a sort of indirect hostility. This is not intellectual moral virtue because it is not engaging with ideas. It is not investigating the reasons for choices and for ideas, and it's certainly not communicating them to other people. When someone attacks the character of someone instead of argument, again, this is ad hominem. I think you have a silly idea, and I think that you're a ridiculous person because of your background, because of the group that you're associated with, something like that. Well, that's not addressing the idea itself and the argument and the reasons for your belief. Even if you do not like a certain group of people, they may still say something good. And so when you are in a debate with someone who you disagree with, don't attack their character, attack the argument with reason. When you repeat somebody else's argument to one of your friends, do you know what that person believes? Oh, they believe this. And you do it inadequately. That's called a straw man fallacy. That means that you're not treating the other person's idea fairly. Perhaps they really do have good reasons. Maybe I don't have good reasons. Or maybe the other person has good reasons and they're still wrong, but at least they're trying. And that's noble to some degree. Even if they're wrong, they still are trying to have good reasons. And then if you go off and repeat their argument inadequately, that's called a straw man. Think of getting in a fight where you have a sword or a gun and your opponent is just a scarecrow. Well, he's not going to fight back because he's a fake person. So when you repeat somebody else's arguments inadequately, you're not really engaging with the argument, you're engaging with a fake argument. Also, there's often moments where people are closed-minded in the name of tolerance. I have heard of several college campuses, university campuses, where protests take place that protest certain ideas, and they try to prevent a certain speaker from speaking because they do not like the ideas of this speaker. And they may say that the ideas of this speaker are intolerant. So this protest is in the name of tolerance, but really it is suppressing free speech. Tolerance already implies that there are differences of opinion. And if tolerance actually means respect, then we should encourage people to say different ideas. We should encourage dialogue and communication and not just label different ideas as hate speech and tell them they should not speak at all. Maybe it is hate speech. Maybe it is hateful speech. Maybe it's a bad idea that the other person has. But with free speech, they should still be able to say their idea, and then we should engage in fruitful conversation where we talk about the reasons for why that's a bad idea. We don't suppress conversation, we encourage conversation. Instead of being closed-minded, we're open-minded. Perhaps we do not like the other person's idea, but maybe that's just because it's a new idea. And new ideas are always initially going to be slightly frustrating or make us feel uncomfortable, whatever the case may be. But just because it makes us feel uncomfortable does not mean that it's wrong. Let's hear them out. Also, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when you sit down to do some research or you investigate the answer to some sort of dilemma. Let's say abortion. Abortion is always an easy example. Political example. Is abortion right or wrong? Is it permissible under certain circumstances or not? Well, in trying to answer this question, if you go to the internet or to research to figure out the answer, if you only look for information that supports the idea that you already have, this is confirmation bias. This is not treating the opponent argument sufficiently. In fact, you're not even touching the opponent's argument. You're not really getting challenged or sharpened or encouraged to build a stronger argument. Perhaps you are wrong. How do you know that you're wrong if in your research all you do is try to collect the evidence that supports your claim and you never look at evidence for the other side or arguments for the other side? Especially in, for example, a philosophy paper, when you're writing one, make sure that you engage in a detailed analysis of an opponent's ideas and argument. Do you get what I'm saying by intellectual moral virtue? Let's look at some examples of what's good. Let's discuss with charity. So that when I'm in a conversation with somebody, or even in writing, when I'm engaging with the other person's ideas, let me be respectful and charitable to them. Just because I show one or two ways in which their argument falls apart, in which they have a fallacy, doesn't mean that their idea is wrong. It may mean that they just need to go back and build a stronger argument. That's charity. Let's argue fairly. Let's represent the other person's idea adequately, and let's just have respect for them. And let's think humbly. Let's be willing to admit when we're wrong. As soon as we ask a question, let us be willing to change our mind. If we really love truth, then we will follow it wherever it leads, even into uncharted territory, even into unfamiliar territory. But you know what? If we're afraid to go into unfamiliar territory, then we will never really have new ideas, and we will be set in our ways. Let us be humble enough to have an open mind and the ability to change our mind. Let's talk about worldview. Why do people have different conclusions about the same question? Why are there so many ideas about what's right? Why can't politicians agree? Aren't we looking at the same world? Why don't people see things like I do? We respond differently because we see the world through different beliefs, through different glasses, so to speak. We see the world tinted. When we describe how the world is, we're really just repeating our beliefs about the world. And it's good to have this set of glasses, this system of beliefs. They're like prescription lenses. They bring clarity to the events around us and the situations in our life. We look through these lenses in order to find clarity. When something happens in the world, we know why. We understand why people act the way that they do. It helps us make sense of reality. But sometimes we have to reassess our prescription and think, do we need better prescription glasses? Things are fuzzy, but I don't even realize that they're fuzzy, that I need a better prescription set of glasses. So we each have a different set of glasses. A worldview is seeing the world through your beliefs. Let's look at an example. Is abortion wrong? What do the two groups see? All right, we have pro-life and pro-choice. Pro-life will look at a fetus and say, that's a human life. A pro-choice person will look at the same fetus and say that that is a cell mass, and therefore the choice is the mother's. So we're looking at the same thing through different lenses. But why do they see the same thing differently? They view different things as valuable. Morals are built on values. Both sides value human life, but they do not both value a fetus in the same way because they define human life, or valuable human life, differently. The pro-life side says that human life begins at conception and has equal value with adult human life. Pro-choice side says a fetus is life, but it's not a human life with personhood and quality. Why do they have different values? Well, the pro-life side, we keep going back. For every answer that's given, we can ask a deeper question, and then find another answer and go deeper still. So why do they have different values? The pro-life side, they define all human life as valuable and define it scientifically or biblically. All human life is seen as having personhood. However, the pro-choice side says they define only some human life as valuable based on the quality of life, and the philosophy that personhood is developed through maturity and social interaction. So we keep going further back. Why do they have different views on personhood? They're both largely influenced by major philosophical differences. The pro-life side subscribes to what is called essentialism. This is to say that human nature has a preset meaning. Will you follow it? That's the ethical question. The pro-choice side subscribes to existentialism. We choose our own identity and meaning. Which will you choose? This is how personhood is formed, through our choices. Whereas with pro-life, personhood is determined by simply existing and being human. Of course, there's a lot of different varieties of pro-lifers and pro-choicers. We're just talking about, let's say, a stereotypical example of each of these. Why do they choose existentialism or essentialism? See, we keep going back and back. We could keep going until we get to a point of agreement. We keep investigating the reasons for these ideas, and these ideas are built on previous ideas. This is how argumentation works. You gradually figure out your assumptions and then argue about your assumptions and until eventually you can appeal to shared assumptions. Then we can try to convince someone to change because we share certain assumptions. If we go back and back. Your worldview is your set of beliefs that influence how you see the world, your set of assumptions, which determines your answers to other questions. Your worldview changes constantly in small ways, but infrequently in big ways. So, for example, there may be a new political debate this election cycle, the next election cycle, and your beliefs about that particular debate may change by the day as you figure things out. But your answer to questions like, does God exist? That's not going to change every day. That's going to change rather infrequently. Let's talk about the love of truth, wherever it's found. Do you love truth? Would you accept it, even if someone of a different religion or political party says it? Would you even notice it? See, philosophy is the love of wisdom. Are you a true philosopher? Do you truly love wisdom enough to accept wisdom if it comes from the mouth of somebody who you do not like? For example, does 2 plus 3 equal 5? This is true regardless of whether a Muslim, a Christian, or an atheist says it. Does God exist? The answer is true no matter who says it. Would you notice and accept the truth even if your most despised politician said it? Are you open to that? If more people were, we'd have fewer arguments. What is an argument? Well, it's a disagreement, of course. It's a defense with reasons. An argument is not the same as a fight, at least not a philosophical argument. You can have a fight where you're just barking opinions at each other and getting angry. But are you discussing reasons? Then it's an argument. A fight is bickering about opinions and not reasons. For example, let's say you want to take someone out on a date, and you're trying to figure out where to go. You can go to a restaurant or a movie. You only have time or money to go to one of those. You're trying to figure out, you're comparing these ideas. But then you remember that you have a friend's birthday party that you're really committed to. You're really committed to this friend and you've already said that you're going. But then your girlfriend says, no, I want to go to the movies. Forget the birthday party. And then you start on a conversation. You have an argument. You give an idea and you give reasons for why you should follow through with your idea. And she gives her idea and reasons for why her idea is the one that you should follow. Who is right? Look at the idea and its reasons. So an argument is an idea or a thesis plus reasons or the justification for it. Whose reasons are best? Who's right? That's why we have critical thinking tools, and we investigate the reasons for beliefs, especially intellectual moral virtue. Let us converse with each other with virtue. Ethos, pathos, and logos are three elements of the presentation of an argument. Aristotle says, of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are three kinds. The first kind depends on personal character of the speaker, that's ethos. The second, on putting the audience into a certain frame of mind, that's pathos. The third, on the proof, or the apparent proof, provided by the words of the speech itself, that's logos. Let's look at this in more detail. Logos is an appeal to logic. It's an investigation of the argument itself, the idea and its reasons. But when I tell you my argument, when you see an argument on Facebook, when you see someone present an idea and its reasons on the news, you can also ask about the pathos and how they deliver it. Do they appeal to emotion? How do they appeal to emotion? This is to say, pathos is the eloquence or style or entertainment value of how an idea is delivered to us. And then there's ethos, which is an appeal to character, which is essentially to say, do we trust this person? Now, in terms of persuasion, this goes from top down. The most persuasive element of the presentation of an argument is ethos. First, you ask yourself, do you trust this person? If the answer is yes, you may not even investigate the argument itself. You may not even care about how eloquently this person phrased their argument or how much entertainment value this movie had. If you trust the person, you may not even ask those other questions. But if you do not trust them, then you'll appeal to whether or not they seem like they know what they're talking about, whether or not they appeal to emotion. Are they relevant? Are they boring? Are they entertaining? Are they humorous? These are appeals to emotion. Lastly, the least persuasive part of the presentation of an argument is the argument itself. But you see, in terms of critical thinking, it goes in the reverse order. Something is true not just because you trust the person who says it. It's true not because of the emotional appeal, because of how eloquently or entertaining the speaker was. It's true for reasons, for an argument. Let's look at some examples. How can we analyze a commercial with these tools of ethos, pathos, and logos? First, let's look at the ethos of a commercial. For example, a Coke commercial. It has trusted and recognizable celebrities to deliver pleasure. We trust that these particular movie characters or actors will continually deliver entertainment value and pleasure to us in different ways. So we trust the celebrities. We trust the actors. We also trust the name brand. If you have a choice between a Coke and something strange, you'll choose a Coke. You go to the store and you see two different sodas next to each other. One of them looks strange and the other one is Coke. You'll choose the one that you trust. Pathos. The commercial tends to present clean, iced, and beautiful beverage. It's not dirty or warm. It has a pleasant environment depicted in the scene of the commercial. And beautiful people. They not only choose beautiful actors, but they tend to go in later and doctor the footage as well to make sure that everything looks beautiful. The commercial will have an entertainment value, action or humor, gets you involved, gets you interested. The purpose ultimately is to associate good emotions and feelings with the product itself. Let's look at logos. Sometimes you just want a little Coca-Cola. That's what the tagline is for the commercials about a mini Coca-Cola can. Sometimes you just want a little Coca-Cola. Often there's no logos or direct message because it's a recognizable brand. You look at a Coca-Cola commercial, maybe they don't say anything that's an argument or a thesis. That's just because they already know that they're a trusted brand. Unrecognized brands may have a little more logos, but at the end of the day, advertisers know ethos and pathos are more persuasive than logos. They don't want you to think and make the choice for yourself. They want you to follow their choice. Remember that in terms of persuasion, it goes ethos, pathos, and logos. Advertisers know this, and that's how they appeal to you. However, if you're a critical thinker, you will think in the reverse order. How do you use ethos, pathos, and logos for critical thinking? When you make your choice of which drink to drink, don't make a purely emotional decision. Ask yourself, what is your goal? First and foremost, what's your purpose? Which option is better for that goal? Which option gives you better reasons? Don't ask which option is more entertaining or trustworthy or comfortable. Note that you should watch the video that I have on Plato's allegory of the cave. This will talk about critical thinking in terms of ethos, pathos, and logos even further. But again, we want to ask, what is our goal? Does that mean we shouldn't trust? No, trust is good, and so are emotional appeals. We don't have the time or energy, however, to investigate things all the time. But do you trust someone for the right reasons? Did they earn your trust through reason or emotional appeal? If you trust someone for good reasons, that trust can turn eventually into irrational trust if it turns into blind trust. Blind trust is when you not only believe it because a trusted person said so, but you say it is true because they said so. Ultimately, something is true for reasons, logos, and not just because someone said so, or it was entertaining or eloquent or gentle. Let's talk about logic now. Logic is a deeper tool for critical thinking. But what is logic? Let's think about earth sciences. We have chemistry, biology, botany. Ultimately, these are based upon physics, the laws of physics that govern the material world. But these are an extension of math, the laws of math. But math is built on logic. Physics, you could say, that's the laws that govern the material world. But logic is the laws that govern thought itself. Physics is the laws of matter. Logic is the laws of thought. Illogical means breaking the laws of thought, or unreasonable. Let's look at an example, like miracles. All right, so we have Jesus walking on water. This is a miracle that a lot of people know about, even if they're not Christian. However, think about it like this. Something can hypothetically break the laws of physics, but not break the laws of logic. If somehow in your worldview there's a way to sort of surpass or transcend beyond the laws of physics, it certainly still cannot violate the laws of logic. Let's look at another example. Can an all-powerful being, maybe God, create a rock so big he can't lift? The answer is no. It's illogical. But this does not necessarily limit God, because at the end of the day, it was a completely illogical concept. It's not really something that can happen, that an all-powerful being can create a rock too big, because those are mutually exclusive, contrary ideas. If a being is all-powerful, then he cannot create something else that is more powerful than himself, because by definition, that's a contradiction. It's an illogical concept. Let's look at another example. This might be the clearest one. Can you think of an apple, both existing and not existing, at the same time and in the same way? No, it's impossible, because the law of logic, called the law of excluded middle, says everything must either be or not be at the same time and in the same way. what's the best you can imagine? We can think of an apple kind of blinking in and out of existence. That's probably the best we can come up with for an apple existing or not existing. Or in your mind, you can sort of imagine sort of two different spaces or moments in time in which you have an apple that exists and another space where it does not exist. You cannot ultimately think of an apple existing and not existing at the same time and in the same way and in the same place. Here's another example. Can this statement be right? There's no such thing as truth. The law of non-contradiction says nothing can both be true and not true at the same time and in the same way. If the statement is true, then it's false. There's no such thing as truth. If that's true, it can't be true because the statement says it can't be true. There's no such thing as truth. So if it's true, then it's false. But if the statement was already false to begin with, then of course truth exists. So either way you look at it, the statement contradicts itself. It has circular reasoning. Now let's talk about some basic principles of logic. We're going to talk about quickly the structure of an argument, valid versus unsound argumentation, deduction versus induction, 3 classical Aristotelian laws of logic, the principle of sufficient reason. Let's look at the structure of an argument. An argument has 3 parts. You have a premise or an assumption, and then built on that assumption you have argumentative steps, and then you have a conclusion. Let's look at an example. Premise 1. Every change or effect has a cause. This is just the principle of sufficient reason. If something changes, you can ask why it changed. There will be an answer. Premise 2. If the Big Bang happened, it was a change. Now, first step in our argument. If every change has a cause, which is premise 1, then we can trace cause and effect like a chain or dominoes. If change is a chain of cause and effect, then there must be a first cause that started the chain, or a first domino that was knocked over. Our third step, if the Big Bang is a change, it has a cause. By definition, the first cause must be something that never changes and always existed. Therefore, we have our conclusion, which is that a first cause must exist. You can ask a further research question. Is that cause God? Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. That's a different argument. Let's talk about valid versus sound. A valid argument is where the argumentative steps don't break the laws of logic. That means they don't contain any logical fallacies. So the steps of the argument will be valid if they don't break the laws of logic. A sound argument is one that is not only valid, but it also has true premises. The whole argument is good. So valid is good, but somebody can have a valid argument, but it starts from some wrong assumption, and you investigate that assumption. Every assumption is going to be the conclusion of a prior argument. So you can keep investigating the reasons for beliefs further down and further in. Deduction versus induction. Deduction is when the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. It has to follow from the premises. For example, premise 1, a bachelor is an unmarried man. Premise 2, Socrates is an unmarried man. Therefore, Socrates is a bachelor. This is called a syllogism. It's the simplest form of an argument. If a bachelor is an unmarried man and Socrates is an unmarried man, therefore Socrates is a bachelor. It's really just cutting out the middle idea. It necessarily follows that Socrates is a bachelor from those premises. Let's look at another example. Simple example. Socrates was born in Athens. Athens is in Greece. Therefore, Socrates was born in Greece. Conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. A deduction cannot fail. This is like math. It is always the case. However, induction is observing patterns and what usually happens. But this can fail because it's a rule of thumb. It's not math, it's a pattern. Let's look at an example of induction. So here I am, I'm walking to the store. I have an idea of what I want to buy. I want to buy some ice cream to keep me cool, specifically some strawberry ice cream. I have an idea when I go to the store of where it will be located. I think it's going to be along the edge of the wall where the freezer section is, and I'll go over to that section, I'll start looking for desserts, and within the dessert section, I'll find the ice cream. This is induction. This is the pattern. This is what's usually the case in a shop. And then I actually go inside the shop. What do I find? Well, I see the ice cream section, but I end up finding that my favorite dessert, my strawberry ice cream, was somewhere else. It was on a special display. Maybe they were having a sale. I don't know what the case is, but my particular favorite brand of ice cream was not where I thought it would be. Induction sees patterns and makes judgments based on patterns, but it can be wrong. Even if the probability is very small, it can be wrong. So induction is also going to be as simple as the chair that you're sitting on. You expected that when you sat down in the chair or the couch or wherever you're sitting, that the chair would hold you up. That's because every time before, it has held you up. However, we also know the case that doesn't have to be the case. Someone can play a prank on you. Someone could pull the chair out from under you. Someone could do something to the chair where as soon as you sit in it, you will fall down. Because induction just sees what usually happens and makes a judgment based on it, but it can be wrong. The three classical Aristotelian laws of logic, we've already mostly touched on these. The first is the law of identity, which is just to say that whatever is. This is in algebra as well. A equals A. We've already touched on the law of non-contradiction, which says that nothing can be both true and not true at the same time and in the same way. And also the law of excluded middle, which says that everything must either exist or not exist at the same time and in the same way. We've also talked about the principle of sufficient reason briefly. Leibniz says sufficient reason is that by virtue of which we consider that we can find no true or existent fact, no true assertion, without there being a sufficient reason why it is thus and not otherwise, although most of the time these reasons cannot be known to us. What does that mean? Well, it means that if there is something that does not have to be the case, if there is something that could have been otherwise, then we can ask, why is it not otherwise? If we have a choice between A and B, if there is an option between A and A happens, then we can ask, why did A happen and not B? There must be a sufficient reason. Although he also says that oftentimes we can't figure it out. We don't have enough information. We may not be aware of the sufficient reason for why something is the way that it is. Every change and contingency has a reason. But what's a contingency? Something that exists dependent on something else and does not have to exist. It does not have to be this way. It could have been a different way. That's something contingent. That means if it does not have to exist, but it does exist, there must be an explanation. Let's talk briefly about logical fallacies. We've already mentioned some of them. The definition of a logical fallacy is when you break the laws of logic in your argument. This is also related to intellectual virtues such as humility, charity, and respect. So if you have intellectual virtue, then you will more likely not break the laws of logic. We already covered some of these. We mentioned attacking character instead of an argument. This is ad hominem. Also, not respecting someone, disrespecting them, instead of having a respectful conversation, that's going to be ad hominem as well. And then if you repeat somebody else's argument inadequately and misrepresent them, that's called a straw man fallacy. And then if you do research and all you look for is a confirmation of your bias, that's a confirmation bias, instead of a fair treatment of an opponent's view. Also, we can talk about chronological snobbery. This is to say, oh, that's an old idea, it must be wrong. Well, it's not wrong because it's old, it's wrong because it has bad reasons. Maybe it has good reasons. You could have the reverse. Maybe you're some kind of a traditionalist and you think that it's better if it's old. And the new is newfangled ideas, newfangled something. Just because it's new, it's a bad idea. Well, that's not the case. It's a bad idea or a good idea based on reasons. Because something is true no matter who said it, no matter where it was said, no matter when it was said. It's true for reasons, not because of time. We can also talk about correlation that does not imply causation. So let's say you're going to work. You get to work late, and you blame the traffic. It could have been an alarm. Your alarm went off late. Or maybe you blame your alarm going off, but actually it was the traffic that caused you to be late. So we have different factors that happened, different things that happened. Your alarm went off late, and there was lots of traffic. But just because those pieces of information are present does not necessarily say which one caused you to be late. Perhaps some third factor, unforeseen factor, or some factor that you're not aware of came into play. This happens all the time in statistics. Two statistics will be proposed, and someone will say that one thing caused another thing. Just because these two things are associated together all of the time does not mean that one of them caused the other one. Perhaps it's the other way around, or perhaps some third factor caused them both, or perhaps it's just a coincidence. Correlation does not imply causation. Let's go back to thinking about those commercials. Appeal to emotion is a category of logical fallacies. If somebody says, this is true because of peer pressure, this is true because everybody believes it, this is true for fear tactics. Let's say, this is true because if we don't believe this, then something bad is going to happen. Or this must be true because it feels right. It's so entertaining. It's funny, so it has to be true. Something like that. These are appeals to emotion. It's not true because of the emotional appeal. It's true for reasons. Equivocation. Equivocation is when we talk past each other. We feel like we're talking about the same thing because we're using the same word, but really we're not. It's like comparing apples and oranges. For example, in the abortion debate, we talk about a fetus, but a fetus really has a very different idea behind it depending on who is talking about it. If a pro-lifer is talking about a fetus, then they mean a life, even though they're using the same word as a pro-choice advocate who means that this is a mass of cells living inside of a woman's body. In other conversations, when we have a disagreement about what something means or what we should do about a certain idea, we're talking past each other because we're using the same word referring to two different things. So the disagreement may be because we mean two different things with the same word. Let's talk about the meanings of the words instead of just the word itself and getting confused. Also, we can talk about false dichotomy. When I say you have to do either this or that, and there's no other way. You got to do choice A or choice B. That's called a false dichotomy. It may be right that those are the only two options, but perhaps there's a third option. Perhaps there's a middle way or just a third way completely. Just because someone tells you that there's only two options does not mean that there's only two options. There could be a third option. The genetic fallacy. This is to say that something is wrong just because of where it came from. Well, you could say that idea was started by my least favorite politician, by the politician that I hate. Or that idea was started by a political party that has a history of advocating slavery. Well, just because the idea came from a bad location or a bad group of people does not mean that the idea itself is bad. In fact, we need to get past this in order to have fruitful conversation. For example, a good example I like to use is Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is a Christian Catholic in the Middle Ages, and he adopts a lot of ideas from Aristotle, who is a pagan, a Greek pagan, as well as Maimonides, who is a Jew, as well as Averroes and Avicenna, who were Muslim. So just because those ideas came from groups of people that he disagreed with does not mean that the ideas themselves were wrong. He accepted some ideas and dropped other ideas. Just because an idea comes from a place that you do not like does not mean that the idea itself is wrong. Slippery slope. This is when you say, oh, if you go down that road, if you choose that option, then it'll lead to this and it'll lead to that, and eventually all chaos will break loose and society will break down. So don't even take the first step because of all of the consequences that are going to come from that action. Well, it's not necessarily the case that my choosing this particular option is going to lead to all of those consequences that you talked about. And even if it does, that does not make my current choice wrong. Maybe this is perhaps a very persuasive emotional appeal, but it is not a logical argument that just because I choose this, it's going to lead to all of these other implications. Let's recap. We talked about intellectual moral virtues. We talked about worldview. We talked about the love of truth wherever it's found. What is an argument? Ethos, pathos, and logos. What is logic? Some basic principles of logic, and some logical fallacies. Let's talk about the write-up for this video. I want you to go watch 3 commercials. Try YouTube. Super Bowl commercials are really good ones. And then write at least one sentence explaining the ethos, pathos, and logos of each commercial. That means 9 sentences total. So look at 3 commercials and then analyze each commercial with ethos, pathos, and logos, and write a sentence for each one of those categories, analyzing these commercials, practicing critical thinking skills with this tool. And then submit your answers online. That's it for this video, and I recommend that you go see What is Philosophy? Another video of mine just explaining philosophy as kind of a map for where we can locate certain ideas.